Karlee, why don't you tell us a statistic?
Well, Chris, 70% of rural electric co-ops have a voter turnout rate of less than 10%.
How many?
70%.
70%.
Right.
Wow. Hannah, about how many electric co-ops are there in the country?
There are about 890.
Okay. I've seen 867. I think these things are hard to count.
867 are the distribution electric co-ops, and then there's another couple that are just like generation and transmission.
How did I know that you would have a more specific answer on that if I pushed you a little bit? Today, we're going to talk about cooperatives, and specifically electric cooperatives, what we're kind of calling the promise and the perils of co-ops. You're listening to Building Local Power from the Institute for Local Self-Reliance, and the first voice you heard was Karlee Weinmann.
Hello.
And the second voice was Hannah Trostle.
Hey.
And they're both research associates with the Institute for Local Self-Reliance. Karlee focuses on energy, and Hannah does more of the broadband type work and does a lot of our work specifically on rural broadband. And I'm Chris Mitchell. I kind of run the broadband work, or I guess I think of it more as managing it, because almost all the work is done by other people. And we're going to be talking about cooperatives today and how they can build local power, really with a focus on how they can build power in rural areas. And we're going to be talking about power in a different sense as well. So let's get to it. So I think we'll start a little bit with the peril and ask a question about why it's a problem that many people are not participating in the democratic governance of their co-ops, where, just to be clear for people who may not be as familiar, being a member of the co-op, taking service from the co-op, means that you are a voter and you help to pick the board that sets the direction of the co-op. And so effectively, you should be participating in running it, but many people are not doing that.
Right. So many people don't even realize that by getting their electricity from a co-op, they in fact are an owner of that co-op, which gives them theoretically a say in the strategic direction, policies, and other decision-making that happens at the co-op board level. So how it's supposed to work is that all the member owners of a co-op will elect a board that theoretically represents them and their interests and can advance policies that they're on board with. Unfortunately, that's not happening in very many cases, as that statistic shows. Engagement is low. People aren't realizing they have this opportunity.
Or obligation.
Yeah. And in fact, in many cases, there are barriers put in place requiring in-person voting or other restrictions that make it difficult to participate in that process. So while co-ops sort of exemplify this democratic ideal in principle, that's not translating to reality in a lot of cases today.
It seems like there might be at least two separate issues. One is apathy, a natural apathy of people that are not participating. And the second might be some cooperatives that are going out of their way to make it harder for people to participate.
Exactly.
Okay. Because I know, for instance, that when I'm a member of a couple of co-ops, and for the most part, I get something in the mail and I send it back. And that's a very easy way to vote. But you mentioned in-person voting, where some of these cooperatives make it very hard to vote.
Right. There's in-person voting requirements that we've seen. In some cases, there's sort of this convoluted nomination process that favors incumbent board members, which contributes to the intransigence we see in policy, and that shuts people out.
Let's just ask why that is a problem, because the rural electric co-ops have still done an incredible job. I think of, if you want to look at rural electricity versus other infrastructures, for instance, broadband, the rural electrics do an amazing job, and in many cases they're actually starting to get involved in broadband. But fundamentally, they have continued to provide reliable power at low cost. And I suspect that is a part of the apathy, is that people are sitting there thinking, well, if my power was flickering on and off every day, I'd probably be more interested in voting. But it's not. It works. So why is it a problem if we have these low voter turnouts or barriers to voting for co-ops?
I think fundamentally, the more people that are involved, the better these co-op strategies and policies are going to reflect what people truly need. And that also ensures that there's space for changes and adjustments and improvements as markets change. So with regard to electricity, there is a lot of movement happening in that marketplace right now. There needs to be room available to develop distributed resources like solar, like wind. And in a lot of cases, we're seeing co co-ops that, for a variety of reasons, including obligations to coal and general wariness of change, that are preventing that development from happening. And pretty soon that's not just going to be a bad decision, but it's going to be highly destructive to their customers and their members, their owners.
Okay, so we're talking about someone that may be living in this territory of a cooperative and wants to put solar on their roof. What kind of barriers might they face?
In Minnesota, something that we've seen arise in recent years, as interest in rooftop solar has risen, is the imposition of outsized fees for those rooftop solar installations. And what that means is that the co-ops are charging enough in some cases in extra fees specifically for rooftop solar projects to make it financially not feasible. And there is some dispute resolution proceedings ongoing at the Public Utilities Commission right now. And in fact, this is enough of a problem that it's become sort of a spotlight issue this legislative session with the advent of proposed legislation that would remove dispute resolution proceedings like that from the PUC to the co-ops boards instead. So that would essentially potentially give the co-ops free rein to impose these fees.
So what we've long seen with co-ops is that a lot of times state and federal law will often carve out space for co-ops that's different than like a Duke Energy or an Entergy or Xcel Energy. These big electric providers, they get regulated closely. But co-ops, because they are so responsive to their members in theory, they have more authority to impose these sorts of fees that, if Xcel Energy was doing this, the Public Utility Commission theoretically would be all up in arms and saying, nope, you cannot impose these fees.
Or at least it's a guaranteed check on those fees.
Sure. Now, I think it's worth noting that on the flip side of the coin, the co-ops have more power to be self-governing. We're seeing some co-ops really doing smart things with that.
True, very true. I spent a few days in Iowa last summer learning more about a co-op called Farmers Electric Cooperative about 30 miles south of Iowa City that has made solar work in spades in their community. There are farmers all across the hills that you can see when you come into town that have solar panels on their roofs. Businesses in town have solar right on the front of their buildings. And I think that's really an indicator that there are co-ops out there that are finding ways to not only have their members understand how things like solar can work for them, but actually finding ways to implement solar in a way that is financially feasible, financially beneficial, and just really a good idea for the people that they serve.
Hannah, I want to bring you into the discussion about the co-ops. I'm curious, we've, from the broadband side, I think we're just so thrilled and excited about what the rural electric co-ops are doing. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, there are right now just about 50 electric co-ops thinking about doing some sorts of fiber projects. Some have already started and completed them. Others are working with the local telephone companies. Some have actually worked together in order to build middle mile networks. And it's overall pretty exciting, but it's also rather new.
Right. You were saying that. I was thinking that because I think a discussion I recently had with someone from, I believe it was the North Arkansas Electric Co-op. He's also the president of the co-op trade organization. He was saying, I said 10 years ago, not very many were doing this. And he said, 5 years ago, practically no one was doing it. So this is a rather new development.
It's not entirely brand new in the sense that electric co-ops have been in this space before with the broadband over power line experiments that didn't really go very many places.
Many of them have also experimented with partnerships with satellite. I mean, they're aware of the need in rural areas, and they've been trying to find ways of responding to it. And they've also historically run their own fiber optic lines to substations for monitoring and quality purposes and that sort of thing. So even though they haven't made fiber available to others, it's something that they're very familiar with technologically.
Yep, it's already part of their networks. So right now it's just figuring out ways to extend it further, whether that be to businesses or just to the community anchor institutions like schools and libraries. Most of the 50 electric cooperatives now seem to be interested in fiber to the home.
Yes. So I guess I would just be curious, we haven't really said why, Why, from the ILSR perspective, from a perspective of local self-reliance, why do we care that co-ops are getting into this? Why is it a big deal?
From the ILSR perspective, it's a big deal because this is another way that people in the community can actually own their internet infrastructure. They don't have to rely on big corporations, and it's a good way of getting things that are beyond DSL out in rural areas.
Right, making sure that these rural areas aren't left behind. They actually have infrastructure that's comparable to what we have in urban areas, and in many ways superior even. I mean, if I could move to Missouri and take service from one of these co-ops, I would have much better service than I can get in St. Paul, where I live.
Actually, we should just move the ILSR office up to my hometown, which already has fiber to the home. And it would be fine.
And interestingly enough, it's pretty close to my wife's parents' place, so I'd have a place to stay. And yeah, I'd be okay with that, at least maybe on Fridays and Mondays.
Only on Fridays and Mondays.
Right.
These fiber projects really do have to be democratically owned. So that goes back to Karlee's point about how the voting structure of electric co-ops right now is not really great for making sure that works.
It's interesting because I want to just press you on that. Why do they have to be democratically owned? But then I also want to follow up on the board question. So when you say they have to be democratically owned, it's a technology. Anyone could do it. What does the democratic ownership matter?
Well, there are so many different ways to do fiber projects. It really matters what the local community needs. If the people on the board aren't representing what the community actually wants, then it's not going to work real well. If they go about doing a fiber to the home project and no one actually wants high-speed internet service at home, what they really want is high-speed internet service at their local businesses, in their schools, then the co-op has just wasted a lot of time in doing these really small test projects when they could have been going out and doing a lot more throughout the entire community because they serve a really large area.
Right. And I think it's worth noting that one of the things that we see co-ops doing is after there's a change in general manager or on the board, you might see more willingness to engage in this because you may have people that have been on the board for 40 years and their mind is set in a certain direction. And the idea of getting involved in something so new and risky relative to everything else the co-op does is different and scary in some ways. Now, one of the things that I just wanted to throw out is I remember most of the Midwest co-ops that I've talked to, they have a real sense. The cooperative spirit is that you serve everyone. But I've heard that some of the co-ops that were built in areas that used to be rural and are increasingly exurban, they may be thinking about doing fiber to those exurban parts, but leaving behind the more rural parts. And I don't know exactly how you deal with that. Clearly, the economics of doing fiber in these exurban neighborhoods is going to be better than out in the farming areas. But I think that's going to be a crisis of leadership that will come forward, and you'd really want to make sure people are active in their voting as those decisions are being made. So I'd like to turn to some of the economics of this. And Karlee, one of the questions that I had for you to lead this off is, why should we be so concerned? I still think a lot of people think of solar as something that's nice to have, but you pay a premium, and then you can say you're not burning fossil fuels and things like that. Is there an economic imperative to get away from coal? And can you tell us a little bit about how all these things work?
Distributed generation, such as solar panels, particularly on a person's roof, are becoming more and more affordable as time goes on, putting them within reach of more and more people. So if you think about the wider impact of that, that's pretty huge. When you factor in not only the financial bottom line, but the environmental benefits, the social benefits, and all these other things with relation to the cost of fossil fuels in those same regards, I think that the benefits are very clear. And I think that as the marketplace shifts to make more space for these new technologies, we need to be really aware of how we can use them to create economic benefit, particularly at the community scale, which is something that we've seen pioneered in communities like the one in Iowa that I mentioned earlier. So it's definitely possible to use these new technologies for economic, social, environmental benefit. And I think we need to recognize and not be afraid to innovate, particularly in rural areas where these utilities have a huge opportunity to make it happen for themselves.
You mentioned earlier that the electric cooperatives have these contracts with coal and these sorts of things. How long are these contracts? What is sort of the format?
What's happening in a lot of places is that the distribution co-ops that will actually distribute your energy and deliver your bills get their energy from what are called generation and transmission, or G&T co-ops. So those larger co-ops are the ones that are making sure that your distribution co-op can get power to you, to your house, to your business. Where those generation and transmission co-ops are sourcing their power is pretty dirty these days. So distribution co-ops are under contract, in many cases very long-term contracts with those G&T co-ops to source their power.
Means 60, 70 years?
Means decades.
Okay.
Generations, maybe even in some cases. So the co-ops that serve everyday customers are bound to these contracts with G&T co-ops, which rely on coal, for decades, in some cases generations. And on-site power, like rooftop solar, from members is exempt from those contracts, but the co-ops themselves remain on the hook for that coal generation and the infrastructure that it requires to process it. So big plants, all these things that the industry is generally moving away from.
Right. So in some ways, and this is something I really feel for co-ops, for generations, we saw electric growing, right? Demand was increasing. And you engage in these, you would know we're going to have a lot of people demanding this. Now, you have a twofer hitting these rural electric co-ops. One is, in many cases, they're losing population, so their demand's actually declining now. They still are on the hook to buy all that power. People are using LEDs, they're doing energy efficiency stuff, so their needs are going down. And then people are putting solar on the roof, so they really feel like they're stuck.
Right. And when the utilities are not keeping up with the way the market's changing and what their members want, because remember that if a co-op is facing this dilemma, it's because it has members that want to install rooftop solar. And when they're not responsive enough, they're just, wasting time that they could be spending trying to find solutions, which, are available and need to be available, frankly.
Right. Now, Hannah, one of the things that this plays into with the fiber, I think, is that where we see co-ops building fiber, their demand is decreasing less, or it starts to increase again. Because one of the reasons people are leaving these territories is because they do not have good internet access. Whereas the electric co-ops that are building the networks they have some of the best access you can get in the entire country. And in fact, in some cases in the world, I would say, because you can get a gigabit for less there than you can almost anywhere else.
Yeah, and they also will have way more devices if they have good internet access, and all those devices need electricity. Even if each device on its own is actually not using that much, but collectively they will increase your energy needs. I can remember I grew up north with an electric co-op. And
when Hannah says up north, she means north of Brainerd. And so for a lot of people who've never been to Minnesota, but have only seen the movie Fargo, Brainerd has a lot of Minnesota to the north of it. And that's where Hannah's from. I've been up there as well. It's great country.
Yep. It's sort of not really northern Iron Range, but not really central.
It's up
Minnesota
there.
Lakes. It's pretty far up there. I remember when we started getting better internet access, we started getting more devices, and my dad looked at the power bill and was like, "What happened?" and went through the house and pulled out all of the cables.
Right, that Xbox that never turns off.
Yes, the Xbox never turns off. The PlayStation never turns off.
Right. So, I mean, in some ways, if co-ops would take all of our advice, I think we'd solve all their problems. That's what I'm hearing. Sure.
They just need to take their members' advice. I think we can settle for that.
Yeah, fair enough. All right. So, moving on to that part of the show in which we give a little bit of reading advice. Hannah, what do you have to suggest that people might want to check out?
I would suggest Vivek Shreya's Even This Page is White. It's a collection of poetry. It's made by this Canadian artist about anti-blackness. That is like the topic of poetry. It's pretty fun. I believe it's VIVEKSHRAYA.
I have to admit, I'm a little weak on poetry myself. I read magazines cover to cover because I'm a giant dork, but I skip the poetry because I find it's too hard to understand for my brain. So I'm curious what you're bringing, Karlee.
Well, I've got some nonfiction for you this week, Chris.
It is a little bit more my speed, I'm afraid to say.
So I would highly recommend a book called Evicted. It's by...
Oh, yeah!
Have you read it?
I've not read it. I've heard the interviews.
You
and I'm
have to read it.
And I really want to do a show on it in the future.
Yes, everyone must read it. It's by a Harvard sociologist named Matthew Desmond, who writes in a way that no sociologist I've ever read can. It's very journalistic and very focused on storytelling. It's about the way that our housing economy is so inequitable, specifically with regard to low-income renters. He does deep ethnographic research into the rental economy in the poorest sections of Milwaukee, which is one of our nation's most segregated cities, to show just how hard it is for particularly women and children to get any sort of leg up whatsoever, and as an extension of that, how hard it is to build any kind of stability or wealth when you can't have home.
It's great that you recommend that. One of the things that I really like about it is that it's really gives a full picture. He talked with a lot of landlords too,
right.
and dealt with them to give a sense that it's not like one side is like the good side and then you have the bad people that are ripping them off. It's very complicated.
It's very complicated. His telling is very even-handed, and some of the landlords are sympathetic too. It's a story without an agenda that leaves you feeling called to action, which I think is very difficult to achieve, and also, really emphasizes the urgency of the issue.
All right, so I want to make a quick 2 recommendations building off of those. One is Calvin Trillian, a poet that I have read because he writes very short poems, and they're very funny. 2 things that I love.
Chris is a haiku guy.
Yes, and ideally a haiku that has a pun in it.
You can read all of Vivek's poetry in under 2 hours, and she also is a music artist, so you can just listen to it.
Ah, okay. So I need to broaden my horizons. I want to recommend a nonfiction book also, which is Kathy O'Neill's Weapons of Math Destruction, which I've been recommending to people before I read it, and now that I've read it, I really want to recommend it to people because it's a very short, engaging, fast read. In fact, I would say that unless you're really into the weeds like I am, you could just read the first 100 pages and you'll get most of what you need out of it. But it's incredibly important for the modern era where these algorithms are determining so much about what we're paying for cars, what we're paying for many of the products that we buy, if we deal with the justice system, whether we're likely to get justice or not. It's incredible how these algorithms are taking over and how little people actually understand about how flawed they are. So highly recommended. Let me just take a minute to thank those of you that have been rating us on iTunes and in other places where you may get your podcasts. It's really going to help us to make sure that we're showing up in the rankings somewhere and that people are serendipitously finding us. So please do take a minute to rank us wherever you found us. But with that, we'll hang up the microphone and we'll just encourage people to go out and build local power for another 2 weeks, and we'll come back and talk about this again.
Thanks, Chris.
Thanks, Chris.
Thank you.
That was Karlee Weinmann from the Energy Democracy Initiative and Hannah Trostle from the Community Broadband Networks Initiative. They sat down with Christopher to ponder building local power and electric cooperatives. Christopher is director of the Institute's Community Broadband Networks Initiative. For more on electric cooperatives, you can check out ILSR.org and also muninetworks.org if you're interested on how they're bringing internet access to members. We encourage you to subscribe to this podcast and all of our other podcasts on iTunes, Stitcher, or wherever else you get your podcasts. You can also sign up for our monthly newsletter at ilsr.org. Thanks to Dysfunction Al for the music, licensed through Creative Commons. The song is Funk Interlude. I'm Lisa Gonzalez from the Institute for Local Self-Reliance. Thanks again for listening. This has been episode 12 of the Building Local Power podcast.